If you're a parent or a teacher, you may well be sick of what feels like non-stop reviews and changes and promises when it comes to school curriculum and funding. So just what are the latest proposals likely to mean for your children? The federal government's going to work with the states looking at the recommendations of a new review into the Australian curriculum. The 30 key points include a renewed focus on phonics in the teaching of reading and less content in the primary curriculum. Shortly, we'll speak to two school principals for their take, but first this report from Tracy Bowden.
Can you see any connections with rites of passage perhaps that you might go through in our culture?
These 11 and 12-year-olds at St Ambrose Primary School are studying one of the three central themes introduced as part of the National Australian Curriculum.
We use incense in the Catholic Church, and they have smoking ceremonies at their significant times during the year.
This is an English lesson, but they're also learning about Indigenous rites of passage. The themes of Indigenous and Asian perspectives and sustainability were firmly in the sights of Federal Education Minister Christopher Pyne when he announced the review of the curriculum in January.
I'm not sure what the relevance to maths of Australia's place in Asia is, or indeed Indigenous Australia. So there have been criticisms. It's timely to review it.
Next year, 2011, Australia will have its national curriculum for the first time.
The Australian curriculum was a signature policy of the Rudd government, launched in 2010.
What we're on about is making sure that the absolute basics of knowledge, the absolute basics of education are taught right across the country.
Given the Australian curriculum is only just being rolled out in some states, opinion was divided on the need for a review.
Clearly, it is a political exercise. There is no reason for a review to have been conducted at all.
I think it's perfectly justified for an incoming government to have a review into the content of the curriculum when the previous government set the content of the curriculum.
Who's this individual here? What's important about him? Layla? Edmund Barton. And who was he? He was our first Prime Minister, okay?
The teaching of history was investigated, along with the courses for English, maths, science and geography. The reviewers also tackled a common concern, that the curriculum has too much content.
Right, any questions?
There is so much there at the moment that it is simply impossible to teach it in depth. So students run the risk of getting a superficial understanding of subjects where in fact they should be exploring the ideas much more deeply rather than learning the facts at a sort of shallow level.
Put up your hand if you've got another ooh word.
The reviewers agreed that the curriculum is overcrowded and should be taken back to basics.
Moose?
The review itself says that when children leave primary school and go to high school, it's more important that they have a depth of knowledge in the key areas like literacy and numeracy than that they have discussed every aspect of the curriculum.
To make the sound ooh, we go like this.
Among its 30 key recommendations, the review suggests a greater focus on phonics, a method of teaching reading by matching letters to sounds.
X to the power of 0.
In maths, it proposes a more rigorous curriculum modelled on what's taught in Japan. And in history, it recommends more emphasis on Western civilisation and Australia's Judeo-Christian heritage.
So what's one of the examples from the Aboriginal culture?
The reviewers also suggest that those three key themes, the cross-curriculum priorities, should only be taught where relevant.
I think this probably frees the curriculum from the strictures of trying to make the content match themes and instead allow the content to speak for itself.
Put in your variable X.
The review has received broad support across the education sector, but there is no guarantee the recommendations will be adopted because the states and territories, not the federal government, decide what will be taught in schools.
There's no direct responsibility for implementing any changes arising from this review. What all the sectors have said, however, is that we're going to look at the recommendations.
The Teachers' Union continues to argue that the review is a distraction from the real issue, funding for education.
This review was announced for one reason and one reason only, and that was to distract people's attention from the government's failure to commit to the funding reform. If there was no Gonski funding reform, there would be no review of the Australian curriculum. There was no reason for it.
There's nothing in it that I can see that the states and territories would balk at, because none of it is trying to drive a political agenda. All of it is making a good fist at improving the outcomes for our students.
The federal government will now work with the states and territories to consider the recommendations. Christopher Pine says he'd like the changes adopted in 2016.
Because that bossy E makes this letter say its name.
2016 is a ridiculously short time. We need to appreciate teachers have been very heavily involved in learning how to implement the existing Australian curriculum. To ask them to turn around on a 5-cent piece and change it all again, relatively speaking, overnight, is just unreasonable and impractical.
Wow, that made me fume!